Good afternoon to everybody. I want to thank the Beverly Hills Bar Association for sponsoring this program and graciously giving 1 hour MCLE credits to anyone who needs or wants it. I also want to thank the California Lawyers Association for co-hosting this program. You can link to the materials. All of the persons who have registered materials should have been sent to you, and also it will be in the chat, but the materials should have been sent to you. I want to say hello to everybody out there and thank you for joining us. We have an exciting program today. We have the bio of the participants, the panelists. You should take a look at that, but I just wanted to read some of refer to a couple of them because we have these distinguished participants here. We have Cheryce Craemer, who is a distinguished attorney. She's licensed to practice in the states of New York, Massachusetts, and California. She's an undergraduate of UC Berkeley and a graduate of Howard University School of Law. And she is a registered NFL Player Association agent. And she practices in the area of sports law, entertainment law, and compliance. And our other presenter is Dr. Thomas Craemer. He is a distinguished scholar, and he is he is a professor at the UConn, University of Connecticut. And he has 2 PhDs. He wasn't satisfied with one, apparently. So he has 2, one from his his native country of Germany, from University of Tuebingen, and another PhD from University of New York at Stony Brook. Okay, and also he teaches in, I guess, the Political Science Department of Public Policy. And he wrote in 2015 a very shocking article called Estimating Slavery Reparations Damages. And you've seen him on TV with Kamau Bell, CNN special on reparations. And he recently authored a very elaborate presentation of wealth implications of slavery and racial discrimination for African American descendants of the enslaved. So he's a very outstanding scholar, and I'm happy to have him here with us today. My name is Linton Akins, and I'm a mediator. I mediate in employment law here in Southern California, primarily. And my bio is also in the paperwork that's out. I have a PhD from the University of Southern California. And that's not UCLA, folks. If you don't know the difference, it's USC. If there are any UCLA graduates out there, I just wanted to make that distinction. And I practiced law for over 25 years, primarily employment law here in Southern California. So I want to start the program by defining, to the best of my ability, what is and what is not reparation. Reparation is making amends for wrongs, horrific wrongs usually that have been done to a people by their government. It is the call for a payment of debt that's owed based upon slave labor, or wage theft, and it comes with a certain amount of atonement if it's to be effective, and because the person who is making the payment also has to acknowledge that wrong has been done. It's not like tort law where I admit no wrong, but I pay you $25 million. It's not quite that. That doesn't go over so well. I'm a recent participant in the study of reparations, but I've developed an explanation or a definition of reparation, and I'm going to just read that and say a couple of words about it before I turn it over to the panel. Reparation is payment by a government entity to a specific group of people for having committed terrible wrongs and injustice against the group in violation of humanity, as distinguished from what a government entity does for a group of its people and taking care of their welfare. And what I mean by that is that you will find people who refer to, well, we've given them reparation by putting a recreation village in their community, in their ghetto. That's not reparation, folks. A good government ought to do that for its people. So it's what a government does for its people is not reparation. For example, we want to feed kids. We don't want our kids to starve. Giving kids a good lunch is not reparation. You're just taking care of their welfare. So that's what you're doing for them, as opposed to what you've done to somebody. So I've developed that in studying, and I imagine I've stolen ideas like everybody else steals them from other people, but I haven't seen that particular definition. So what reparation is about? It's trying to restore some equity into the lives of people vis-a-vis other people, in addition to the making atonement, etc. So if we're going to look at reparation, I think we have to distinguish between equality and equity. Equity is basically giving a people what they want and need to help make them equal. And equality aims to ensure that everyone gets the same thing and is treated the same way. So equality can only work if everyone starts from the same place and needs the same thing. So equality itself becomes injustice if it is applied to people who are vastly unequal. I'll give you an example. Everybody is familiar with the 100-yard dash. If you start one people at 10% and one runner at 10%, another runner at 90%, and you apply absolute equality to those runners, absolute in every way, you give them the same starting block, same everything, who do you think is going to win? So we have here a situation where, because of the blacks were enslaved and a tremendous amount of wealth was passed on and has been inherited, primarily by whites, we have a situation where black Americans are on the 10-yard line in the race and whites are on the 90-yard line in the 100-yard dash. And I'll give you one more example, since we're all lawyers, a lot of us are lawyers. We have something in law called remedies. It's really punishing someone or rewarding someone in an equal fashion, basically. And I know we have a lot of subscribers who are not lawyers, but look at it like this. different remedies have to be applied to different wrongs. If a person is driving down the freeway at 90 miles per hour and the cop sees him and gives him a ticket, he's going to pay a fine in California of about $1,000. So that's the remedy for driving 100 miles per hour on the freeway. But if he goes out and murders someone, he's going to be sent to the penitentiary for the rest of his life. So different remedies apply to different people and to different situations. So we can't talk about, okay, everybody has diversity and inclusion now. That's not equality, and that's certainly not equity. So I wanted to mention that and give that analogy because I think it makes a lot of sense. And with that, we'll start. Tom, are you ready with your slides?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, well, why don't you take it away with your slides? And by the way, we're going to have questions at the end of the program.
Okay, Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to thank you, Dr. Lenton Akins and the Beverly Hills Bar Association for inviting me to give a presentation on reparations for the descendants of American slaves. What I would like to do is first give a personal motivation and an introduction, then talk about US slavery reparations proposals throughout history, and precedents for slavery reparations. And I should warn you, those are all in the wrong direction towards slave owners rather than the enslaved. And then I'll show how I went about estimating US slavery reparations just to get a ballpark figure. As for my motivation, as was already mentioned, that I'm originally from Germany. I was born in post-World War II Germany, raised in Tuebingen, which is a beautiful city or town. But in high school, I learned about the Holocaust in every single school subject and felt ashamed of my history and always had the wish to express to a Holocaust survivor how ashamed I felt. And then, of course, I never thought this would ever happen. But then one day I met Mieczysław Langer, a survivor of 5 concentration camps and a death march in his youth. And in his retirement, he relocated from Israel, of all places, to Germany. And he treated me like a son. I couldn't believe it. So our 2 families went on a spiritual journey to Poland, to the concentration camp memorial sites where he lost his entire family. Here's a picture at the Płażów concentration camp memorial site. Mieczysław with his grandson David. And I was always wondering, how was Mieczysław ever able to regain trust in Germans or in Germany as a country after the suffering that he went through as a young man? And of course, I don't want to take anything away from Mieczysław's incredible humanity, but I think what I'm going to show you next probably didn't hurt. And that was the fact that Mieczysław received a reparations pension from the 1970s all the way until he unfortunately passed away in 2015, from the West German government first, and then from the government of reunited Germany, worth about $2,000 per month in 2018 dollars. Now that's not much. It's clearly not enough in any way. It's merely a symbolic gesture. So that's what I'm thinking about reparations. It can't undo the damage, but it can make words of apology more meaningful. And then, of course, there are differences with the example of Holocaust reparations and proposed slavery reparations. In Germany's example, the perpetrators and some of the victims were still alive when reparations were negotiated in 1952. But what about slavery reparations in the United States? Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell opposes paying reparations, saying none of us currently living are responsible for slavery. That's not entirely true, because the federal government that allowed slavery to exist is still living. It ended slavery through a civil war with great expense in blood and treasure, but it did not provide reparations to the enslaved. So it ended the injustice, but that's different from actually paying reparations to the enslaved. And we all have a responsibility in it, I feel, including myself as a recent immigrant to this country, because we all, at least indirectly, benefit from the startup capital that slavery provided to the US economy, and we're attracted to this country because of its strong economy. Now, let me talk about a number of slavery reparations proposals throughout history. The earliest example that I could find was George Washington, here pictured with his slave Billy Lee that accompanied him throughout the Revolutionary War. Lee was freed by Washington's will along with all the slaves that Washington held in his own name. And he wrote in his will, "It is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom, seeing that a regular and permanent fund be established for their support, so long as there are subjects requiring it." George Washington's will was widely circulated in the newspapers of the day to set an example for the voluntary abolition of slavery. Now, that was a naive idea. It obviously didn't happen. But what's unique about this example is that Washington thought about establishing a fund for the enslaved rather than for the enslavers, as all other abolition proposals at the time sought to give reparations to the slave owners for the loss of their property rather than to the enslaved. Another example is the notion of 40 acres and a mule, which goes back to General Sherman's Field Order number 15 of 1865, whereby 40-acre parcels of land were distributed to 40,000 freedmen and women until President Andrew Johnson returned the land to the former slave owners. Representative Thaddeus Stevens introduced a reparations bill calling for 40 acres and a mule, but it failed in 1866 and 1867. But the notion of 40 acres and a mule stuck around. And these proposals inspired land-based reparations demands that echoed through the next century. For example, Sojourner Truth in the 1870s called for land-based reparations. Queen Mother Moore in the 20th century called for land. Dempsey Travis in 1970 called for a new Homestead Act that would accomplish this. And most recently, William Darity and Kirsten Mullen in their 2020 book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, also use land-based reparations as one way of calculating reparations. I'll get back to that in a minute. There were other reparations proposals throughout this centuries. Kelly House in the late 19th century recommended pensions to formerly enslaved. She went to prison for her efforts. Marcus Garvey called for European reparations for colonial depredations in Africa. James Forman in 1969 called for cash reparations from faith groups that benefited from slavery, and he was able to collect some. And then economist Robert S. Brown demanded in 1974 a transfer of a sizable chunk of America's wealth to the Black community. Now, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which provided $20,000 per survivor to Japanese American World War II internees, accompanied by a letter of apology from the US president. And this motivated John Conyers to introduce House Bill HR 40 for the first time, I think in 1989. Correct me if I'm wrong. Basically, and it's currently introduced by Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. The bill itself does not provide for reparations, but for the formation of a commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. In 1990, economist Richard F. America published the book, The Wealth of Races, which is an edited volume where economists used a price-based estimation method based on historical slave prices to estimate what the slave owners gained from slavery. I'll refer back to that in a second as well. In 2014, the issue of slavery reparations went mainstream, and this is largely thanks to Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic. And with that, I'm turning to precedents for slavery reparations. The most egregious case is the Haitian independence debt, so-called. Here is a picture of Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the leaders of the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. They were able to permanently abolish slavery in first Saint-Domingue, and then they founded the Independent Republic of Haiti. And in 1825, King Charles X of France sends a fleet demanding an indemnity from Haiti for the former owners. So these owners that had fled to France were supposed to get reparations from the former slaves. And Haiti, in order to maintain its independence, had to agree to this devilish deal. And the crippling Haitian independence debt was financed through loans with French banks. And these were serviced from 1825 to 1947 over a period of 122 years. The original claimants weren't even alive at the time. This was all to descendants. Often it's said we can't pay reparations because it's too difficult to trace. The French government did a great job tracing these individual claimants through the generations. The other example is reparations to British slave owners. In 1833, the British government abolished slavery, took up loans and paid reparations to slave owners. It serviced those loans for 182 years, from 1833 all the way to 2015. It literally just got done paying that off. So it settled generations of British with a debt for slavery. In the United States too, we have an example in the District of Columbia. In 1862, the US government abolished slavery in Washington, DC, providing $300 in reparations per enslaved to slave owners. Reparations for about 3,000 formerly enslaved were paid out at the height of the Civil War, when every penny counted for the preservation of the Union. Now, with that, I'm going to talk about ways how US slavery reparations can be estimated, this time for the descendants of the actually enslaved, not the enslavers. There's a formula that Professor Swinton published in Richard F. America's edited volume, The Wealth of Races, in 1990, where he provides formulae how different historical injustices can be accounted for in an additive way, counting lost income, lost freedom, lost opportunities to accumulate capital, as well as pain and suffering for colonial slavery, then slavery during the United States, and then for discrimination after slavery. I'm going to present only one of those boxes, and that's lost income due to US slavery. I'm not going to talk about colonial slavery, not about post-slavery discrimination, not because I don't find it important. Actually, I do, but because I don't have the data necessary to do those estimations. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to get the total loss that African Americans suffered from these injustices. I'm only focusing on one single element, but it's already whopping enough. There are three approaches to estimating US slavery reparations. As I already mentioned, land-based, price-based, and I use a wage-based method. The land-based method uses the current value of 40 acres and a mule. The price-based method takes the expected return from owning a slave. My critique is that this only counts for the 12-hour daylight hours during the day that the enslaved were working in the fields for cash crop production. Anything else was a cost factor to the enslavers. That's why I use a wage-based method where I'm arguing that the enslaved lost control over all 24 hours of the day and would have to be compensated at the hourly wage in the free labor market at the time. So the land-based method, I calculated all of those in 2018 dollars to make them comparable. The land-based method produced an estimate of $2.978 trillion based on Darity's work. A price-based method, $13.2 trillion in 2018 dollars based on Marchetti, also in The Wealth of Races. And the wage-based method that I published in 2015 would in 2018 dollars be $18.6 trillion. Those are whopping amounts, but I want to show you how I arrived at this estimate. And basically it's fairly simple. You need the number of enslaved people in every year from 1776 to 1860. And I use US Census information to get estimates. And then historical unskilled wages from 1776 to 1860. I'm ignoring centuries of colonial slavery and the years from 1861 to 1865, as the number of enslaved remaining is difficult to estimate. So overall, it's a conservative estimate. Here are the US Census figures about the population of the enslaved in every decade from 1790 to 1860. And what I do to get the annual estimates is I use linear interpolation for the years in between censuses, and I'm using linear extrapolation for the year 1776 to 1789. Other methods could be used, but this is a fairly simple way. And then I have the production workers' hourly compensation in nominal dollars for the year 1790 to 1860. And you see that in 1790, the wage was only 2 cents and it didn't rise much by 1860. So those are extremely puny amounts, again, arriving at a conservative estimate. And here's an excerpt of my Excel spreadsheet. In the first column, I have the year. Then I have the number of the enslaved, italics if it's estimated, bold print if it's measured. And for wage as well, italics if estimated and bold print if measured. And then the hours per year, that's the number of enslaved times all the days in the year times all the hours in the day. And that multiplied with the wage gives the annual total. And that is then accumulated up and compounded with only 3% interest. And this goes at the bottom of the page till 1794, but I continue this process until 1860. And from then on, I use this formula to compound it up to 2018, again at 3%, which barely makes up for inflation. I arrive at a total amount in 2018 dollars of $18.58 trillion. For comparison's sake, the US GDP in 2018 was $20.89 trillion. So it's roughly 1 year worth of the US GDP, conservatively estimated. Taking an interest rate of 6%, that's the interest rate Georgetown University used in its sales contract when it sold 272 slaves in 1838 to save the institution from financial ruin. If I use that percentage, 6%, the debt balloons to $6.2 quadrillion. So basically what I take from this calculation is the interest rate will be the single most important number in any negotiations between the African-American descendants of the enslaved and the US federal government. So in conclusion, the goal of reparations to African-American descendants of the enslaved is, in my view, at a minimum, closing the per capita black-white wealth gap, which was estimated in 2018 to amount to about $352,000 per African-American descendants of the enslaved. The wage-based reparations at only 3% interest would close that comfortably. Other amounts are still outstanding and they're additive according to Swinton's formula. So there's more research to be done and more negotiations to be had. The portion of the losses to be compensated should be negotiated between the federal government and the descendant community. The same, in my view, goes for the modalities. Should it be cash? Should it be trust funds? Should it be pensions, health accounts, educational funds? Also between the federal government and the descendant community. I would like to say one thing though about cash reparations. I did some public opinion research and found that cash reparations are the least popular modality of reparations. Other modalities, however, require administration by well-meaning black or white administrators, and thus they, in my view, they carry the risk of paternalistic racism. Cash payments avoid this risk, restore decision-making to the rightful heirs of the enslaved. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ending this share here.
Okay, then Cheryce, are you ready for your presentation?
I am ready.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Thank you for having me today. I just want to say I do not have slides, so I'm going to talk and hopefully only for about 10 minutes because I would actually like to leave the rest for questions. So how did we get here? Or I should say, how did I get here? Talking about reparations. My grandmother was a Mississippian through and through. Fannie Lou Hamer was one of her sheroes. And so were the slate of Black politicians who were elected out of Mississippi post-emancipation. She made sure I knew who all these Black heroes were. Fast forward, at 16, my church held a Powernomics workshop by Dr. Claude Anderson, and I'll talk about him at the end. I listened to Dr. Anderson lecture about Black labor and white wealth and the need for reparations for Black people descended from slavery. From there, I was hooked. At Cal, my minor was African American Studies, and more recently, I got involved with some grassroots movements that had to deal with reparations, a Black agenda for the DNC, and AB 3121. Hopefully we can talk about that as well, because I know Biden has the Lift Every Voice plan that he put out this year. So there's always this question of why should Black people get reparations? Who should be entitled to reparations? Why reparations? And I'm going to try to answer all of these questions. And for the lawyers in the room, I'm going to IRAC my presentation, and I hope I make my 1L Torts professor proud. So the issue here, whether descendants of American slavery are legally entitled to reparations. Rule: the US government has a history of paying and supporting reparations to those who are victims of racial injustices or paying it to their living descendants. First, Indian Claims Commission was created. Also, the Bureau of Indian Affairs to redress indigenous peoples who were and were not alive when the heinous acts occurred against them. Next, we have Civil Liberties Act of 1988. We talked about that earlier, a United States federal law that granted reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned by the US government during World War II. Also, the State Department has paid or approved 90 claims for a total of $11 million in reparations from France to former World War II prisoners who were carried to Nazi death camps in French trains. The first French reparations paid to Holocaust survivors living in the United States. The payments applied to Holocaust survivors who were deported from France to concentration camps on stifling trains operated by the state-owned French railway. Or if the survivors had died, to their spouses and their heirs. The Clinton administration appointed as special representatives of the president and Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues, who successfully negotiated major agreements with the Swiss, Germans, Austrian, and French, and other European countries covering restitution of property, payment for slave and forced laborers, recovery of looted art, bank accounts, and payment of insurance policies. Does this sound familiar? The US to Aleutians of Alaska. The Japanese weren't the only ones who were displaced during World War II. While it was fighting against the Japanese, the US occupied islands of Kiska and Utu and the Alaskan Aleutian chain and deported 881 Aleuts to camps in Juneau, Alaska. In 1988, about 450 living survivors of the camps were awarded $12,000 each. The city of Chicago to victims of police torture in 2015. The city acknowledged that more than 100 Black prisoners had been subject to torture by the police, which pushed some to confess to crimes they had not committed. Florida to their survivors of the Rosewood Massacre. In 1994, the state of Florida issued $2.1 million in compensation to be split amongst the massacre survivors. North Carolina to eugenics victims. In 2013, North Carolina became the first state to pay reparations to victims of forced sterilization and eugenic programs through a $10 million agreement. Also in 2015, Virginia started a compensation program for victims of eugenic sterilization. The US to victims of the Tuskegee experiment, settling for $10 million worth of reparations for the survivors of the study, their widows, and their offspring. In 1995, they also were given a guarantee of free lifetime medical care for the victims, their children, and spouses. That was also added to the reparation sum. Finally, the rule of law that I'm applying is basic principles of contract law, equity, and justice. Application. The US government was complicit in allowing slavery. In fact, many elected politicians engaged in the slave trade, slavery ownership, and sexual assault of human chattel, and benefited from the institution of slavery. And we became the great and prosperous country that we see today because of slave labor. And so far, African Americans and descendants of slavery have not received restitution. I'm going to go through a couple of examples. Slave labor built the White House. Slave labor built Washington, D.C. Slave labor built all of the plantation homes you see across the South. Slave labor was the beginning of the Black and white racial wealth gap in this country. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Prior to the Civil War, Lincoln offered the rebel states a compromise. If you free your human chattel, we will pay you for the loss. The rebel states decided that they would rather go to war. Further, some of those who engaged in the practice of owning human chattel were paid for the loss of their freed slaves by the federal government. The federal government did not enforce laws that were required for Confederate and rebel states to re-enter the Union post-emancipation, according to the compromise. Also, General Sherman's Field Order number 15, where we get the term 40 acres and a mule. However, after Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president, he did not honor General Sherman's field order when he assumed office. He vetoed it. Andrew Johnson stopped payment of 40 acres and a mule to the formerly enslaved. He also suggested that Black people immigrate. How about that? Johnson was a former slave owner himself, and that's possibly why he took this stance. We have a history of race riots in the US. The race riots have disenfranchised Black wealth and possessions, land, businesses of Black families. There was little or no restitution for many of these violent acts, forcing Black families to sell valuable land for little of nothing due to violence, eminent domain, to take properties from Black families. And in Southern California, we have the examples of Bruce's Beach and Manhattan Beach and the inkwell in Santa Monica. And I don't think many people know about the inkwell, but we did have an inkwell here in Santa Monica, and now that does not exist. Lynching, redlining, the New Deal, the Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal is the law. And even though this was legal, we all know that separate but legal was a farce. Excuse me. And what could the formerly enslaved do after emancipation? For the most part, many families became sharecroppers because they needed food and shelter. My own family, I come from a sharecropping family. Or they lived on the land left by a former master or family members, white or otherwise. Even though the Freedmen's Bureau was established, the Freedmen's Saving and Loan Bank was pilfered by white executives. Presidential and congressional, inaction when race riots occurred. And with every race riot, every single race riot that has been documented in the US, more Black people were killed than white people, and the government did not take action. Federally sanctioned redlining, again with the New Deal, the Federal Housing Authority mandated segregation and discrimination in the housing market. Now, what was this all about? At the end of the day, it was about money. White people, white Americans became rich off the blacks of Black people, and so did this country. Free labor, free sexual relations, free possessions, free land, free money. The US government has breached its contract with the descendants of slavery. 40 acres and a mule, we never had that. And by allowing terrorism, violence, and discrimination of Black people without intervening. I could go on. And here is my conclusion. It was clear that the United States profited off of slavery and the institution of white supremacy. We were once one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Our GDP and per capita, per citizen rivals that of first world nations. But of this wealth, prosperity, and opportunity was because of hundreds of years of free labor from its human chattel. The US owes a debt to the descendants of slavery, and that is what reparations is about. Even if we start with simply the breach of 40 acres and a mule. Also, sharecropping in states that allowed or enforced heinous institutions of sharecropping acted as de facto slavery. We also had chain gangs that were allowed, and further racism in the judicial system. Those who can trace their lineage back to an ancestor who was living during this time are entitled to reparations. And when I say this time, I mean during slavery. Even if a person cannot explicitly trace their lineage back to slavery, if they can trace it back to a time where Black codes were enforced, and I'm equating the Black codes with de facto slavery, then they should be entitled to reparations. You know, and to elaborate, Black codes included forced apprenticeship, corporal punishment, and denial of the rights to testify. And some people may ask, why should the US government or the federal government pay reparations? And the simple answer is for deterrence. In the law, or legal jurisprudence holds that you can penalize bad actors so they will not commit the same wrongs again. The government has still allowed discrimination, racial prejudice, and a persistent racial wealth gap to last. And finally, there is a solution to this. Companies and businesses that have benefited from slavery, institutions that have benefited from slavery, such as Harvard and Georgetown, and federal and local governments need to create a pool of resources, coin the reparations superfund, cash, land, mutual bonds, etc., and establish a Bureau of ADOS Affairs. If you are not familiar with that term, ADOS, that is American Descendants of Slavery. And this bureau should be similar to what we see with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, excuse me, that will administer payments from this reparations superfund to those who can certify that they are descendants of American slavery and have identified as Black on the last 2 census records. And if you go to ADOS101.com, some of that information is there. And then I'm going to give you suggested reading because there's a lot of valuable information out there. And this is information that is available to everyone, but it may help clarify some questions or concerns some people might have about reparations payment and who should get it. The first is going to be Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. This is the first recommendation. This is an excellent book. The next one is From Here to Equality by Dr. Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen. This book is excellent. It's very thorough. It's probably the most thorough book I've read of all books on African American history, and it really helps to connect the dots and really make the case for why reparations for descendants of slavery. The final book is The Case for Black Reparations by Boris Bitker. This book is pretty old. It's been out there for a while. And actually is told from a legal standpoint, but really focuses on people who were in the segregated school system in the US and why they should be entitled to reparations. So those are the 3 readings that I would highly encourage you to seek out. And hopefully we are able to answer any questions that you may have because my presentation, my part is done.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I just like to have a couple of comments. Tom, I know that you only have conducted research and have your suggestions from at the time we became a nation in 1789 until 1865. You know, I wanted to just bring it up so that people in the audience can understand, and I'm sure you would agree that this does not really represent hardly anything in comparison to what the wealth of the country is, and it's a political question. It's not an economic question. We could take care of this matter very shortly with $10 trillion over a few years. We take care of it. But I want to point out to the audience that it's really worse than what Tom has estimated, because when Thomas Jefferson signed the Declaration of Independence, we were British at that time. But Thomas Jefferson, when he signed that declaration, he owned almost 200 slaves, I believe. And I know he owned 16,000 acres of land. So he came into the Union with a tremendous amount of wealth, and so did a lot of other people. So if there's an argument after you get your data together with the colonial period, these people amassed, the slaveholders amassed tremendous wealth prior to the Union. And they didn't just come in, as we say in political science, tabula rasa, you know, they came in with a tremendous amount of wealth. I believe about 13 of them were major slaveholders, but I Googled it, and in Google, and I don't know whether this is true or not, it says 41 of the representatives who signed out of 56 to the Declaration of Independence were slaveholders. So anyway, I wanted to mention that. Another thing I wanted to mention also was the fact that I'm new to this research. I've read a few books, and the one that she cited, but what bothers me, or what kind of sets me off, there's always this argument against reparations for Black Americans. But, you know, there's the same argument doesn't go for other folks. It's when it comes to Black Americans that the United States government shouldn't pay. But the United States government has paid reparations to a lot of folks, and it's in some of my materials. So I wanted to just mention that. And there was I took notes, and this is very informative. There was a point that I wanted to make. I don't have a math background. As a matter of fact, I only finished the 8th grade. My parents died when I was very young, and I had to go work in the fields with the Braceros. I'm from Texas. So I only finished 8th grade, but I don't have a lot of calculation. I don't have a lot of algebraic formulas in my head, and I can't do a lot of stuff. But there's a famous bank robber by the name of Willie Sutton. And Willie Sutton was asked in his old age by a reporter, "Sir, why did you rob banks?" And he said, "Well, that's where the money is." And I have adopted that philosophy. And, you know, I'm not very math inclined, but I did look at 246 years of slavery. And the Japanese were paid $20,000 each for and they were in not concentration, but relocation camps for 3 years. And if you divide 3 years into 246, you get 82. So I multiplied $20,000 by 80 times 82 years, and I came up with, I think, 6.5 trillion. So, you know, it's like, and there's another one, the Occam's razor. I'm sure you're aware of that, Tom. The Occam razor, entities should not be multiplied beyond essentials. And I've applied those formulas in my life, and I found that they're very helpful. And if you really just look at what has gone on with slavery, just common sense would tell you that there's a tremendous amount of wealth owed to Black Americans, descendants of slaves, and not all Black Americans, but the descendants of slaves. Because I also looked at the statistics, and I'll make this point, and we'll go ahead with the questions. I looked at the statistics last night, and when Africans, Black people to this country did not really immigrate until after the the law was passed to open up immigration for other people rather except Europeans in 1965. In 1965, there were 8,200,000 foreign-born in this country, and of that, only 32,800 were Africans. So when Cheryce talks about descendants of slaves, it's primarily African Americans. So I just wanted to make that point. We have a lot of questions, a lot of comments, and let me go to the top here and start. Let's see. Most of them are comments, a lot of questions. Let's see what we got here. These are mostly comments, bear with me.
I can see one question, Linton.
Okay, what is it?
So there's a question, oh goodness, I think it just disappeared. Basically, who should get reparations? And how do we determine who is entitled to reparations? There are a couple of different theories. And one that is, again, on ADOS101.com, and also Dr. Sandra Darity has presented. If you can prove that you have one ancestor who was enslaved in the US, I think there's an assumption that African Americans don't know who we are, don't know where we came from. I can trace my roots all the way back to at least 1750. Maybe not on the Black side, all the way back there, but definitely past 1850 on the Black side, or excuse me, African American side or ADOS side. The other component is a census suggestion or census requirement that people who are claiming reparations or claiming to be descendants of slavery claim that they are African American on the census, or the last, I don't know if it's the last two or last one, but that you identify as Black. Again, African Americans, we know who we are. We know where we came from. If our families are not from this country, or we have one ancestor or two, whomever, we know how to trace it back. We have DNA records. There are census records. There's so many records, especially if your family's from Louisiana. Louisiana keeps and kept excellent records dating back to the Louisiana Purchase, at least at a minimum. So it would take a lot of work, but it's not hard to find. And so, it just a standard needs to be accepted by the government to say, these are the people who are identifying as descendants of slavery. And this is something that we're going to put into law.
Okay, I have a question here. I support reparations for descendants of the American slavery. However, I do wonder how much of a taxpayer's money should go to that. Do you think that the banks and insurance companies that financed and insured the slave trade should pay the bulk of the reparations to Black Americans? I'm going to ask Tom to answer that, but my immediate answer is absolutely not. I think this is a government responsibility. And, if the government wants to go after the companies for some share, that's up to them. But this was an American government that imposed this. The insurance companies did not have the power to do that. Tom?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's the federal government that allowed slavery to exist. The fact that companies invested in that form of then legal investment opportunity is, they didn't necessarily break the law. But I do think they have a moral responsibility. So I think the idea, other reparations cases can provide ideas. For example, in Germany, a collaboration between the government and industries that had benefited from forced labor during World War II was formed, where these companies that profited from slave labor paid into a common fund, and the government paid into it too, and that was used to pay reparations to survivors. So something similar could be done in the United States as well.
Okay,
I just want to I'm sorry, I just want to chime in really quickly. I don't necessarily agree. I think I mentioned the reparations super fund. I'm of the mind that if individual states are going to be paying for reparations or contributing toward reparations, there needs to be one pool similar to what you're talking about, Dr. Craemer, for everyone who benefited from slavery, so we're not getting piecemeal payouts. So if California decides that they want to make payments, or they're requiring insurance companies to pay out, we have banks and companies that benefited from slavery, they're going to pay out, and the federal government is too. That can all be put in one pool, because there's going to have to be a decision with AB 3121. If there's a payout, who's entitled, and how long will you have to be in California before you receive benefits if there are cash payouts? And that's going to get messy. So it could be a situation where how much did you benefit or contribute to slavery can be quantified, and that's how much you will contribute to the pot, because it's going to cut out a lot of
okay, we have another one here. There are many African Americans in the U.S. today who cannot trace their lineage back to slavery. Why should they be a disadvantage in receiving reparations? Cheryce, you can answer that quickly if you can, but I just want to add, that's the very reason why I put those numbers out there. As of 1965, there were only 32,800 Africans of descent in this country who were not descendants of African slavery. So that is not a difficult question to answer at all. Cheryce, do you have any quick comments? Make them short. We got about a couple of minutes.
Yeah, if your family immigrated to the U.S. after the 1965 Immigration Act, you are not entitled to reparations. That's what the Black Agenda is for, and that's a totally separate discussion.
Sorry for interrupting. Also, just please keep in mind that we have questions in Q&A section, and if necessary, we can go over time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Tom, did you find any questions?
Yeah, there is one question in the Q&A that I could address. Why should people today who were not slave owners pay money to people who were not slaves? Why should people who came to the USA after slavery pay reparations? I tried to address this in my presentation because I myself came to the United States after slavery, and I'm a naturalized citizen. And with this citizenship, I embraced the country. I was actually very proud of becoming an American citizen for the very positive contributions that this country has made to democracy and so on. So I'm proud of that. But having grown up in Germany, I'm also used to identifying not only with the positive sides, but also with the negative sides of my citizenship. And with my American citizenship, I feel the same way. If I celebrate the positive accomplishments, then I also must acknowledge the negative contributions, and that is slavery. It's an open debt. It was never repaid. Intergenerational wealth is missing on the African-American side exclusively, and it needs to be transferred. And since this was a government issue, we all are responsible, and that includes African-Americans living today. We are all responsible for what the government did, but the reparations should go to the descendants of those people who were enslaved, the descendants.
Cheryce, you see a question you want to answer?
There's a question in the chat. So someone asked, I'm in favor of measures to close the racial wealth gap and in favor of the concept of reparations. However, I'm concerned about paying reparations to Black families who can trace their lineage to slave while excluding families that cannot trace their lineage, even though they have been impacted by redlining and other discriminatory measures. So as far as equity goes, again, if we go back to people who were enslaved here in the US, the debt owes the US to those the US owes a debt to those families. We're talking about people who came here more recently. Again, if you go to ADOS101.com, there is a Black agenda that elaborates on Black Americans who have been discriminated against and the measures that can be taken by local and federal government to address those other racial issues. So reparations is separate from a Black agenda, which might seek to redress discrimination, et cetera.
Let's see, we have something here, a comment from the chairman of the mediation panel here in Beverly Hills. Let's see if I can pull it up. I saw it in passing. Okay, Glenn says the same is true of shareholders of corporations who are assessed penalties. Current shareholders may be new, but still end up paying through reduction of share value and penalties. Okay, that was a comment. Anybody else, you see any questions? I'm not the only one who can do this here, so please chime in. We have a few more minutes. See a lot of comments.
Sorry, I see another one. People are talking about, someone asked about other non-cash payments. That issue has not been settled. Again, if you go to ados101.com, or even if you look at some of the other Democrats who ran for president earlier this year, they all have Black agendas which mirror one another. That agenda actually came from ADOS 101, but also from the DNC. And they talk about down payments, payments to HBCUs, et cetera. There's a lot of different categories.
Okay, I see a comment here which may be may not be 100% correct. It says, I wasn't aware, well, anyway, let me read it. Why wouldn't the funds come from cotton companies and tobacco companies and sugar companies and the insurance companies and the Catholic Church? I wasn't aware that the Catholic Church participated in slavery.
Yes, the example of Georgetown comes to mind.
Yeah, but that's a one institution. But the Catholic Church itself, did it participate in slavery? Maybe through Portuguese, but we're not talking about the Portuguese. We're talking about Americans. Tom, are you aware of any? I'm not. Are you aware of any participation by the Catholic Church in slavery?
Yeah, I mean, through history, I mean, the Spanish Empire and its conquest in the New World and establishing slavery there, the church was deeply implicated in that. And in the United States, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure whether Georgetown University is the only example, but I don't want to put out anything that I can't back up with data. So at this point, I don't have the answer.
Okay. There's a question here, which is a legitimate question, but this is on reparations for slavery. But it says, can you articulate any theory against caps reparations? Is this one persuasive? Slavery predated the formation of the United States. Well, it seemed like the other instances of action for which reparations have been paid were taken by existing U.S. Does that? I don't know. But anyway, that's not historically accurate. Dr. Craemer just presented a whole, perhaps this this participant wasn't here at the time. Dr. Craemer just really articulated his whole presentation based only upon the United States government.
If I may say something about this idea of colonial slavery, technically, if we could add up the numbers in a similar way, and I think we can if we find the historical information, there's a question whether Great Britain or the United States should pay that debt. One theory would suggest, and this is actually what Thomas Jefferson wrote in the draft of the Declaration of Independence, that Great Britain imposed slavery on the United States. But on the other hand, the founding fathers accepted it. And so they took over the debt, I would argue, but I'm not an expert in this. So there can be various arguments about pre-United States slavery, but I think it's the responsibility nonetheless. The debt doesn't go away, it grows exponentially.
Yeah, just one quick question to Cheryce. What was the title of the last book you mentioned?
The Case for Black Reparations. I typed everything in the chat. The Case for Black Reparations by Boris Bicker.
Okay, thank you. One person asked that. Let's see. Well, okay. Okay, let's see what it says.
I think there were also some questions about the practicability of reparations. How, with these amounts being so huge, how would we overcome the political opposition against such proposals. And I would argue for that it's a process of political information distribution and political discussions. I've seen several things in public opinion that surprised me. For example, how public opinion on gay marriage swung from majority opposition to majority support in a brief period of time. And I think similar things could emerge with reparations as well, that ideas once thought impossible could gain traction. So I'm not totally pessimistic, although of course I didn't see it coming, so I should probably predict whether this one will happen. But I think it's a reasonable argument. So
yeah, you mentioned gay rights, and that's one of the lessons that we can learn from proximity. Proximity means a lot, because a lot of gay people are white, and they're close to their relatives and their friends. So proximity means a lot. I've noticed this in my life, living in a mostly white neighborhood. Whites do get a different opinion of Black people. I mean, that's anecdotally, but I've noticed that. So I think the gay people got their rights in 50 years because basically largely on proximity, and of course the color of their skin. But
I think the proximity argument makes a lot of sense, because that enhances feelings of closeness, and that makes it easier to take the other person's perspective. But I've done some research on implicit identification with African Americans, and I find that that's very strong among African Americans, but I also find it among some white respondents. And if white respondents score high on this implicit identification measure with African Americans, they are also significantly more likely to support issues like reparations for slavery. So I'm hopeful that there is a psychological mechanism by which this can be accomplished.
I see my good friend Margot Boucher sent in a kudo to all of us. Okay, Margot, thank you very much for coming, and thank everybody else for coming. And I think we're running about 9 minutes over, so I'm willing to go until Alex cuts us off. So if you find any more questions, then
I think there's plenty of questions in Q&A section if you click there.
Q&A, okay, I'm just in the chat.
I went over to Q&A. There was a question about statute of limitations for suing or pursuing against companies that benefited from slavery. And my answer is, if we look at tolling, because the wrongs still have not been righted and they're still occurring. And the companies have still, if they're legacy companies, they're still around. My theory is tolling.
Okay, as a question, how do we measure the wealth created from the securitization of credit creation based on enslaved people taking as capital collateral? That's above my pay grade, Tom. Tom, did you hear me?
Tom, please unmute yourself.
Sorry, I was just reading some of the comments. I didn't follow. Can you repeat? Sorry.
It says, how do we measure the wealth created from securitization of credit creation based on enslaved people taking as capital collateral?
That exceeds my pay grade, I have to admit.
Yeah.
I think this is definitely a legitimate question, and there definitely has to be a lot of additional research done. So I think we should start thinking about actually paying out reparations, but keep in mind that additional research needs to be done to address these other.
Here's a question for you.
Justices and other aspects.
Thank you. Cheryce, here's a question for you. What is your opinion about certain ADOS advocates vigorously criticizing non-African-American blacks like Kamala Harris being detrimental to the African-American interests like reparations and merely being a face of representation? This is a book I'm reading. Instead of pushing a political agenda that specifically focuses on ADOS. To me, a lot of these folks are succumbing to a divide and conquer tactic, which basically supports white supremacy.
Again, that topic and something similar is addressed in this book, Black Labor, White Wealth. And I always have people ask who are non-ADOS, what about me? What about me? What about me? Black folks. Let us have something sometime. I don't know how else to say it. We have not been paid reparations for the atrocities that happened to our family members and that continue to happen today. That's the first thing. Second, what I always tell people, I've emailed a couple of people, Jason Johnson, ADOS is a new movement. It's a grassroots campaign. The methodology may not be right, and I don't agree with everything everyone in ADOS has to say. I'm just going to put that out there. However, the politics is solid, and so is the cause. And so when people thought the Black Panther movement was too radical and too in your face, et cetera, and now we hold Black Panthers in high regard. So I would tell you, look at the message and not necessarily the messenger. And Kamala Harris is my fellow Howard grad. I have pictures with her. She's my soror. And so the message doesn't necessarily have to go through the, screaming and hollering from certain ADOS people in the movement. It can go through other channels.
See any questions, Tom?
Yeah, I have two questions.
In the question?
Question and answer thing that are directed at me. One says, has there been a study on reparations due for the discounted citizenship, that is Jim Crow and limited opportunities that African Americans experienced from 1860 to the present day? And I would say there has been research, and there needs to be a lot more research to quantify what those injustices basically cost African Americans. In a recent article in the Review of Black Political Economy, I and a couple of co-authors, all from Professor Darady's Reparations Planning Committee, laid out the wealth implications of slavery and discrimination, post-slavery discrimination for African Americans living today. And we laid out a framework how we could estimate these things, but a lot more research needs to be done to get the actual numbers correct. So,
okay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Okay, I see one. It says, since slavery was legal or prohibited on a state-by-state basis, should not reparations be a state-by-state responsibility as opposed to the federal government? And we can all answer that, but my answer would be the Willis Sudden rule, because federal government, that's where the money is at.
There's not one state in the union who did not participate or benefit from slavery. If you look at AB 3121, which was just signed into law by Governor Newsom a month or two ago, that commission seeks to address what California's part in slavery. So no one was left unscathed and untouched, and they all benefited. So the answer is no.
I would also say that had the federal government prohibited slavery at the founding of the country, no state could have allowed it. So it's the federal government's responsibility, in my view.
Okay, I see one here. I am Jamaican. I am a Jamaican naturalized citizen. I don't deserve reparations, but I strongly support reparations because I have benefited from their enslaved. Let me read it in complete. But I strongly support reparations for African Americans because I have benefited from their enslaved labor. That wasn't a question, that was a comment, sorry. Let's see, how do you oppose?
I see one, and then I might have to go too. It says, Biden and Trump's Black agendas address economic concerns. How do we propose shifting it to an ADOS focus? The Black agenda needs to address ADOS and Black Americans. Continued advocacy. I think people think going to the ballot box and voting is just enough. You need to sit down and have conversations with your local politicians. I'll just put this out there. Mayor Garcetti is in favor of reparations. He supports it. If you live in a city and you know your politicians, or if you don't know them, I would say reach out to them and take meetings with them to advocate your position, whether you are ADOS or not, and whether you want a Black agenda, because they are listening.
Okay, Tom, do you see any questions you'd like to answer?
I see another question that's directed at me, but that I'm not sure how to answer. So the question is, if the US were to stop all federal and state taxes, return all taxes to those who pay taxes for the past 20 years, forgive all student loans and allow for free tuition moving forward, how close would that get the US to somewhat repaying reparations? And I'm not sure whether the question meant just forgiving the taxes for African Americans and free tuition for African Americans. My guess is the numbers probably wouldn't add up to the trillions of dollars needed, but I haven't done the math yet, so I would have to actually sit down and look at that. So unfortunately, I can't answer this question now, but I wanted to acknowledge it.
There's another one that is widely put forth, and I'm going to read this. This is by, well, I won't give any attributions, but let's posit that African Americans, either the vast majority of those who are direct descendants of original slavery or otherwise who have been victims of systemic racism, are or should be entitled to reparations of some sort. Who wants to take that one? Cheryce, did you hear me? You want me to reread it?
I think I did. Again, we're talking about a difference between reparations for payments to slavery or people who are descendants of slavery versus a Black agenda. And those are two separate things. The Black agenda will address or should address the condition of all Black people in the United States. Reparations is a redress for those who are descendants of American slavery and the results of it. So those are two separate issues. And I hope that answers the questions. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I would just say that I really think that it should be known that Black people in the United States were all slaves until slaves are descendants of slavery until the very recent. Colin Powell was born, you all know Colin Powell, he's a general. He was born in 1943, I believe. I think he's 83. And when he was born, he was the first generation from Jamaica. At that time, there were so few people in this country of African descent who weren't descendants of slavery. So I don't believe there's anybody here alive who has Black people who have ancestors that go back to slavery that were born outside of this country. I think like I saw the statistics last night, only 32,800 people of African ancestry lived in this country or were in this country as of when that immigration bill was passed in 1965. So many of those probably were first generations classified. So it's just a question that really, and Cheryce, I think you answered it. There are other ways to address that. Any other, we still have the floor here, so we can answer anything that you see. Oh, somebody said slaves built many of the Catholic churches in the South and missions. I didn't know that. The person who sent that, you can Google me and send me the information on if you have it, just Google my name, Linton Akins, and send it to me because I'd like to do some research on that. I always thought the Catholic Church was in the United States was fairly free of exploiting Blacks.
I wanted to answer Glenn's question at the end. He said any reparations or any redress is going to be subject to a political process. So putting it in standard economic or legal framework is going to be a difficult sell. As far as politics goes, this is definitely going to be a bipartisan effort. If you look at those who are in Congress right now, whether they're Republicans or Democrats who happen to be of African American descent, most of them are in certain states, and they can also trace their families back to slavery. Again, that's on both sides of the coin. And I will tell you, the person who was Trump's stand-in the state of California, Shirley Hussar, is a supporter of reparations and the descendant of slavery. So this is not a partisan. It's not going to be a partisan effort. They're going to have to be Democrats and Republicans are going to have to agree on this. Or my thing is requesting an executive order from whomever, hopefully Biden, but who's going to be in the White House. And I've already tried to start tagging them on social media, because it's probably going to have to start with an executive order.
Yeah, I got the answer to that from the person who made the comment. He said, and I've disclosed too much now, he or she said, Catholic churches in the South listed slaves as assets on their books. I did not know that. Okay.
Jesuits were definitely involved.
It goes deep, doesn't it? Okay, any other questions you see that you see that you want to answer? We still have time. We haven't been cut off yet. Anybody? So I think, well, okay.
I think there's one question. What is your strategy for pushing federal and state governments to act and actually pay reparations? Again, this is going to be picking off one politician at a time. I think as far as the LA mayor's office is concerned, I think we're good for the state. Actually, Newsom was hesitant with signing AB 3121, but if you look at different states, there are quite a few governors, governments, and local governments that have started to sign reparations bills. So it's not something new, and it's not unheard of. These are things that are being talked about behind closed scenes. You just have to be, we have to position ourselves in the right rooms at the right times, and start having a national conversation about this.
Okay, I see one question from a young lady who, from a person who came in probably late, but I'll, just in case it wants to be addressed. How can people accurately track their ancestry? Is there an easier way for the community to do so? Is there a central database that exists that can be created? Were there accurate records kept from time of slavery? Tom, what about the census?
Well, the census is a great resource, and there are genealogists who work with census records and with slave schedules in the South. I think this would be cool as part of a reparations settlement if the government invested research to do this, to do this research about descent on a large scale, and provided so that to prevent that individual families have to invest the money into genealogists and do the research themselves. The federal government should do that, because the federal government also just, kept African-American families from being able to trace their families because the families were broken up through slavery. The case of Georgetown University is very interesting because there it was an alumnus who paid, I think, 7 genealogists to trace the current descendants of the 272 slaves who were sold by the institution in 1838. And they were actually able to identify thousands of individuals. So this work can be done. It's not super easy for the beginner, but it can certainly be done by professionals very straightforwardly. The records are all there.
Okay, I wanted to just in closing mention that I think we can all be located if persons want to write us, ask us questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll forward them on to someone who does. So we're all easily locatable. Cheryce, they can find you by going to the state bar, right?
They can email me, Cheryce at CraeyerLegal.com, or I just reopened a Twitter account, and you can look for Esquire Activist or P Bison 1867 at P Bison 1867, and okay. I will only be talking about reparations on that Twitter page.
Yeah, Okay, and Tom is easily accessible. So we're all accessible if you need to send us notes. So I think it's time now. We've gone over. I really appreciate. We've gone over almost a half an hour. So I really appreciate the Beverly Hills Bar Association and the California Lawyers Association for permitting us to do this, go over, and also for sponsoring and hosting this event. And one person who asked about somebody who opposes slave reparations. That was not this program, but if you want to have a program like that, I'm sure that Beverly Hills Bar Association or some other association would be able to accommodate you. But bear in mind, we weren't dodging the question. I have a list of 25 objections that I could send you if you want to send them. Yeah, but if you want to send it to me, I'll send them to you. And I'm trying to develop more. So if anybody out there have heard of all objections, like I just came here last week and why should I pay and all these objections, I'm putting a list together. So that if that would be helpful. So I think we need to. We're not afraid of competition. I'm not afraid. Tom's not afraid. Ms. Craemer, Cheryce is not afraid. These are good questions. So send them to us and maybe we'll pass them around. So with that, I want to say I thank very much again, everybody, Tom, Ms. Craemer, for being so hot here and being so enthused. I hope some of that will wipe off on me in the future. So thank you so much. And we're going to say goodbye now. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much, Linton. And Dr. Craemer, it was so good to be here with you.
It was very nice meeting you. Wonderful.
All right.
Adios.
All right.
Ciao, ciao.
Nice. Bye. Thank you.